Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's no level playing field between those who believe in creation and those who believe in millions of years and evolution. When I went through university, it wasn't such a hot button topic because it wasn't so much out in the public arena. But even then, the rumblings were already there. In my first year at the University of Sydney, in my postgraduate degree, a Christian group invited Dr. Dwayne Gish, who was working with Dr. Henry Morris at the Institute for Creation Research in 1975, to the campus at the University of Sydney. And I went to listen to his lecture, and afterwards I was outside on the lawn talking with him and with others. And unbeknownst to me, of course, I should have realised the lawn was actually right next to the geology building. And some of my fellow students saw me there talking with Dwayne Gish, and they put two and two together, and they made a comment to my supervisor, who, by the way, had got his PhD from the University of Cambridge. So there's connections there to Britain. But he called me up about an hour later and said, what were you doing down at talking with Dr. Dwayne Gish? And do you believe all that stuff? And, of course, I answered honestly. Well, he had a Catholic background. He said, look, I'm tolerant. If you want to believe that, that's your business. But if you want to get your degree around here, you better keep your mouth shut and not say anything. So, I had to keep my head down below the parapet and below the radar. When I graduated, after I went out into working with the mining companies, I started writing for the creation ministry that was starting to develop there in Australia, and did more so when I moved to Brisbane to work with Ken Ham full time. It wasn't long before, because of our public ministry, that the issue was getting out there, that there were those who were very upset that people like me were involved in that issue. And there are actually 2 attempts to have my PhD revoked. The professor, the head of the Department of Geology, was approached on one occasion. On a separate occasion, the University Senate was actually approached. In both instances, they said no. He met all the requirements that we laid out, stipulated. My thesis, my dissertation was examined by international experts, etc., and I met all the requirements, so they rejected that opposition. But here's the point. Even today, people will say, but creation scientists don't publish in the general scientific literature. I have tried, and I know several of my colleagues have tried, simply to do field work and to publish the results from the laboratory work without talking about creation, without talking about the flood. But because they know we are creationists, they reject our papers. I mean, this is well documented. I have been involved several times doing sampling in the Grand Canyon. Now, it would be in other parts of the world, and quite rightly, national parks are protected, and therefore if you want to do research and you collect samples, you need to make application to show that you're a bona fide scientist, and there's rules and regulations. I applaud that. I totally agree with that, because we can't have people, just willy-nilly taking what they want and defacing the beauty of God's creation. And so I've had applied to the Grand Canyon previously, got approvals and collected samples. We've published the results, but it hasn't been in the secular literature because we've been barred. We've tried to, but we haven't been allowed to. So we have to do it in our own literature. Just recently, I applied for another permit and it's been rejected. And we've done because there's a Freedom of Information Act, you can apply to get the background correspondence to what transpired that caused the rejection of that. And ultimately, I went through the process of making revisions to genuine scientific criticisms, but ultimately we can document that it was because of my Christian worldview. And we're currently fighting that at the moment because there's not supposed to be that discrimination. But there is active discrimination. There's no question about it. And so it's not a level playing field. And the reason, of course, is that it's not simply a scientific issue. It's also a spiritual issue. Because what is the bottom line? If there is a creator, then he owns us. We're answerable to him. The Bible is correct. We need a saviour. We're sinners before God. We're rebelled against him. And so people fight against that. And so we should expect that kind of opposition. We should expect that kind of discrimination and blocking us. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do good science. And so we've effectively had to generate our own journals, our own scientific societies where we meet and exchange our research ideas and do our publication. And the interesting thing, remember I was talking to you earlier about the sandstone in the southwestern United States with those beds where you can show that they were deposited underwater. That's a classic example. In the literature, that's regarded as a desert deposit. And yet we have demonstrated by our measurements, by looking under the microscope, several creation scientists, geologists were doing that work. They've tried to publish their results in the standard literature and got rejected. Why? Because it challenged the view that it was formed in a desert. And yet they can overwhelmingly show from the evidence, the observable, repeatable field evidence, that it was deposited under marine waters in a catastrophic manner. And what is even more interesting, if you go back in the literature, back to an article, a technical paper published in 1938 in the Journal of Geology at the University of Chicago, it has exactly the same measurements of the angles that demonstrate that it was water deposited. So it's not rejected because of the evidence, it's rejected because of the implications of the evidence. So no, it's not a level playing field, but hey, that's what we've got to deal with in the battle of ideas for people's eternal destinies at stake.